Today I'll be talking about Cornel West's unique defense of pragmatism in reference to his article, his essay, Why Pragmatism? And in particular, I want to talk about why prophetic pragmatism. Okay, so his argument is that there has been a shift in philosophy from a concern with essences, Plato's ideal forms, exist in a reality that's unchangeable, eternal, and Aristotle's substances, an approach to knowledge which looks at those things which are the bearer of qualities, to a concern with the relationship between knowledge and power. So rather than to be concerned with the relationship between knowledge and an external reality, contemporary philosophy is concerned with the relationship between knowledge and forms of power. But he rejects a purely Marxist approach to understanding how knowledge norms are affected by institutions of power because he believes Marxism is reductive. So Marxism claims that there is an economic base in every society. That's the relationship among people in every society, in capitalism between workers and the owners. It's that relationship that determines, for example, our moral norms. So, for example, the needs of capitalism have been served by the Protestant work ethic. Our legal norms. In capitalist society, the importance put on contractual relationships and private property, our religious views, the importance of the separation of church and state. So he explains the American evasion of philosophy, which later took its form in American pragmatism, as an evasion of a philosophy based on epistemology, a concern with knowledge and the certainty of knowledge and the foundations of knowledge. Either in traditional philosophies, which look at how well our ideas, our mental representations, correspond to the external world by citing the fact that we've got these cognitive powers, memory, analogy, so that we can take what comes in through our senses and our mind will discover or ascertain what mental representations, what thoughts, ideas, beliefs correspond to the reality delivered to us by our senses. And the idea of correspondence is key here. One of the criticisms of any theory of knowledge that's based on the relationship of correspondence between our mental events and the external world ignores the role of language in developing these mental representations. A famous quote from Wittgenstein, "The limits of our world are the limits of our language." And so he also rejects the kind of philosophy of mind theories that want to analyze the subject's mental contents as undeniable occurrences, therefore the form of certainty. So there's been a shift from a concern with certainty and absolute foundations to an understanding of how cultural, social, and political conditions shape what we believe to be true. He claims that Emerson's main issues have been power, provocation, and personality. And they are certainly important issues for American pragmatists because they are extremely important in terms of limiting power, domination, oppression, custom and tradition are really important constraints on a person's mental powers and development of personality. So Emerson recommends provocation as a means for both personal and social transformation. But Emerson's actual application of the concept of provocation was limited primarily, at least in his earlier years, to his speeches and his writings. Cornel West explains this reticence to actually get involved in social action or any form of activism for the purpose of social transformation. Emerson explains this by appealing to two things. His personality, Emerson's personality, was essentially one that wanted solitude and contemplation. And secondly, Emerson had a distrust of not only politicians, capitalists, but also most forms of organization, as well as, of course, distrust of those who are establishing social norms. Okay, so it's important in order to understand American pragmatism to consider its 19th century European philosophical influences in the form of Nietzsche and 20th century philosophical influences in the form of Foucault's writing. So Nietzsche's criticism of morality, and in particular Christian mentality, is due to the impact of the Christian understandings, for example, of virtue on an individual's will to power, which we can understand as a desire not necessarily to dominate all others, but not to be dominated by others. So various Christian virtues such as meekness, poverty, humility, tolerance, mercy, compassion, forgiveness, all these are intended, okay, I think that's pretty clear according to Nietzsche, intended by Christian leaders to suppress individuals' will to power and submit to the desires and dogmas of the church. Now we see a different type of approach to the relationship between knowledge and power in the writings of Michel Foucault. In his writings, he claims in his political theory that it's important to shift our focus from these most obvious forms of political power, namely the power of the state to create criminal codes and which result in incarceration, and to focus instead on how individuals are shaped by other forces of power, by other types of bureaucratic organizations, by a variety of types of discourses and technologies. Although Foucault died in the 70s, I'm sure he'd be interested in the discourses that have been engendered by Facebook discourse, as well as by how learning has been affected by the technology of online learning. So he's interested in a specific type of power, disciplinary power. How social institutions work to get individuals to conform their bodies and minds according to the purposes of bureaucracies and other institutions. So his analysis of prisons, as far back as the 17th century, that's where his history of punishment begins. His analysis of modern prisons is one based on not the direct threat of the violence of execution, but on the way modern penal institutions use discipline and surveillance to influence the minds and bodies of inmates. So in particular, he focuses in many of his historical treatises, he focuses on how being incarcerated in the modern penal institution involves subjecting the inmate to certain spatial and temporal forms of confinement. For example, when the inmate moves from his cell in shackles to the mess hall or to a work outfit, a work job, he shows that the same types of disciplinary tactics used on the prisoners' bodies in terms of movements and timetables, time schedules, are also occurring in the schools, with requiring that students stay in their places and only move out of those desks and places at certain times. Go to the bathroom at 8:10, have a snack at 8:20. How this works to discipline the bodies of young workers, in particular young workers that are intended to function in a capitalist system. And according to Foucault, this same form of institutional power occurs both in the military, when you see pictures, videos of soldiers moving according to a certain march or tempo, and moving their rifles according to a certain configuration. These are all forms of disciplining the body of soldiers, with the barracks getting up before dawn, and all the things, all the constraints on their time and their movement that are essential to the military forms of power. So, another interesting thing about Foucault is how he describes how the modern individual becomes an individual, how the modern human being becomes an individual. And this is typically understood in modernity as where one stands in relationship to current social norms. Your IQ, your health, your criminal record, your credit record. All these things help to discipline you, train you to behave in certain ways in a standardization in order to make your conduct conform to current social norms. So, in essence, what Cornel West is doing is showing how, both in Europe, 19th century on, as well as in the United States, that the philosophy is no longer concerned with transcendental forms of inquiry. What he means by transcendental forms of inquiry comes down to at least two things. Kant's transcendental ego, Kant's transcendental approach to knowledge, which came up with certain a priori, not based on experience, but a priori categories without which the mind couldn't achieve knowledge. Space, time, causation are certain examples. Or it could be, transcendental could mean looking for knowledge and truth in a transcendent realm, like Plato did with the forms. Truth beyond the powers of human cognition. Cornel West describes American pragmatism as essentially ameliorative. How can our current conditions be improved? Dewey, an early American pragmatist, also regarded education as intended to produce a form of learning by the students that will enable them to improve their current social and political condition. Dewey believed this requires social interaction with people of another social class, and that dialogue with different others will help create political justice. A later philosopher, Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher, in his theory of communicative action, described ethical and political truth in a similar vein. Ethical and political truth have a different criterion of truth than scientific truth. The criterion of truth for ethical and political knowledge is that it is a result of consensus among all individuals in a society whose interests are affected by a certain social or political policy. So, the death penalty, issues of abortion. Before it is determined what is the truth about these specific ethical policies, it has to be subjected to a dialogue among everyone in society that has a specific interest in that legislation or social norm. And if it's possible to reach consensus, that consensus will be equivalent to the truth, political or ethical truth. What's different about American pragmatism in its current form is that the ameliorative impulse, trying to make things better, is viewed as best used through social experimentation. For example, Dewey's laboratory school at the University of Chicago, or understanding a strategy for social welfare through cash disbursements as opposed to other social welfare programs. These are forms of experimentation. To understand Cornel West's distinctive American form of pragmatism, it's important to recognize the essential role prophetic wisdom has in finding the truth to our current moral, social, and political problems. So by prophetic, he means by a prophet, this is a stipulative definition, not someone who can predict future events, but someone that is attuned to the concrete struggles of ordinary people. So he takes seriously our contemporary moral discourse as revealing our individual and collective responses to human suffering and human struggle. He takes seriously the actual narrative of Jesus and other prophets in terms of their heroic response to oppression and domination in their respective societies. Now, prophetic pragmatism, unlike Dewey's theory of provocation as a solution to social problems and political oppression, prophetic pragmatism, as well as other forms of American pragmatism, are concerned with how strategies and tactics of thinking and action work to limit operations of power and domination, and how individuals can develop autonomous personalities and characters to live meaningful lives. So the use of provocation is not the same as rebellion, could include disobedience, but essentially it's a technique for upending beliefs that aren't serving humanity. So Emerson had as a important value provocation as a basis to free the uninhibited development of the self. But he himself didn't use it well. He himself didn't use researched strategies and tactics to transform his society. His discussion and writings were mainly addressed to other middle-class scholars. Cornel West also rejects philosophies such as Foucault, which is called, some people have referred to Foucault's critique of power as the great refusal of power. But when Foucault discusses alternatives to current political norms and social institutions, he claims these other institutions or alternatives also function as instruments of power. So there's no positive strategy that's being recommended by Foucault to upend the operation of power, even in the alternatives. A third aspect of his prophetic pragmatism is that it's a Chekhovian view. Chekhov being a Russian writer who was very concerned with evil and the daily struggles, suffering of concrete individuals. I think it's interesting that Cornel West uses the concept of evil in order to understand immoral and unacceptable, cruel actions, because he's a 21st century philosopher who has also seen the rise of the 20th century view that we need to stop thinking about bad people as evil and start looking at them as mentally ill. So a cruel, manipulative, exploitative person with no conscience is now viewed as a sociopath. It brings up the issue that if you define a person's bad behavior in terms of evil instead of mental illness, it's unclear what solutions work to end the evil in that person's character. Interesting that as far as modern psychiatry is concerned and modern psychology, there is no cure for sociopathy. So that suggests that a solution isn't always easily found in the form of psychology. So Chekhov's concerns are West's concerns as well. In terms of nature, its contingency, its cruelty, its arbitrariness, and the crushing fate to human beings given this contingency of nature, as well as the contingency and arbitrariness of history and human actions. So, philosophers that are trying to find abstract theories, unattainable futures, utopian futures, unrealistic dreams of individuals, philosophical theologies aren't necessarily the best strategies for ending human suffering. So Cornel West argues that Chekhov's writings don't conceal human misery, suffering, and trauma, as do epistemological writings, theories of knowledge, and Chekhov's writings don't promise permanent victory over nature and human suffering in an unobtainable political utopia. So this explains why Cornel West, as a devotee of Chekhov's writings, is concerned primarily with the tragic nature of human existence, death, disease, moral conflict, moral failures, moral flaws. And he doesn't believe philosophy should ignore these realities by offering transcendental philosophies which aren't relevant to these concerns. So why is the life of Jesus and other prophets relevant to his Chekhovian prophetic pragmatism? Because Jesus' life, as well as that of other prophets, are paradigms of heroic struggle against political forces, domination, and persecution, and Jesus' concern with the suffering and struggles of ordinary people, suffering oppression, and in need of comfort and hope. From that point of view, Cornel West definitely seems an anomaly among American secular pragmatists, which suggests to me that he may share a concept of truth similar to that of Confucian pragmatism. Confucius held an as-if view attitude towards the worshiping of the gods. His claim is, if you don't believe in the possibility of the gods, you can't benefit from worship or religious exercises. But if you believe in the possibility of God or the gods, then you should behave as if there is a God or as if there are multiple gods. This suggests that a prophetic Chekhovian pragmatist should bracket transcendent beliefs, bracket the solution to mysteries regarding the divinity and the sublime, and refrain from achieving certainty about divinity and act as if this is justified belief. Why? Because it works. Yet, some pragmatists view truth as that which scientists would agree on in the long run. This is very similar to John Stuart Mill's view of truth. That's what would result in the long run if we had an open marketplace of ideas and dialogue. So, getting back to the as-if attitude, so if it works out in the end, there must be some truth in it, otherwise it wouldn't work out. But we may not know in the present why it works. So religious belief may work to provide hope and comfort, but we in the present may not have analyzed the relationship between why it works out and its truth.